Hey, my dear friends. If you're finding joy in our content and would like to support our channel, please contemplate subscribing and hitting that like button. Your support means the world to us and will enable us to bring forth more captivating and fresh content. And a beautiful comment, as striking as the beauty of your eyes, my handsome friend, would truly touch our hearts. It was 15 years ago that I led a group of Boy Scouts into the Georgia wilderness on what was supposed to be a week-long survival trip. I was 25 years old at the time and working as a wilderness guide, leading camping and rafting trips throughout the southern Appalachians. There's nothing quite like imparting wood lore and survival skills to eager students, especially the wide-eyed adolescent scouts who viewed me as an awe-inspiring wilderness guru. This would be my first time guiding Troop 119, a group of scouts from Atlanta venturing out on their first overnight backcountry excursion. I aimed to make it a trip they'd never forget. We departed on a crisp Saturday in late September, the leaves just starting to kindle with autumnal fire. There were 12 scouts altogether, accompanied by 2 parental chaperones and myself as their guide and mentor. As we drove west from Atlanta into the Chattahoochee National Forest, I studied the boys through my rearview mirror. They were a boisterous but good-natured bunch, all around 12 years old, their faces glowing with excitement for the adventures ahead. Jason was the observant one, already studying the passing terrain through sharp eyes. Ben's ready laughter filled the van at every joke. The Martin twins, Michael and Patrick, were mischievous pranksters, pushing and jostling each other when they thought no one was looking. Young Thomas clung anxiously to his father, Mr. Woodson, one of the chaperones. I made a mental note to give Thomas extra encouragement, sensing his hesitation. After 2 hours on the road, we pulled up to the trailhead parking area. The forest rose around us, lush and primordial. I instructed the boys to pack only essentials into their backpacks for the 6-mile trek to our campsite. Once satisfied with their pared-down gear, we hit the trail. At first, the boys stuck together in a tight knot, jumpy at any unfamiliar forest sound. But as the miles rolled by uneventfully, the group began to spread out and relax. Some brief bravado even led young Ian to bound ahead, loudly proclaiming he would scout the route for dangers. I gently reined in his zeal, getting a kick out of his spirit. We reached the camp, tucked against a sloping hillside and surrounded by soaring pines. A cold mountain stream burbled nearby, perfect for filtering drinking water. I set the boys to clearing rocks and sticks to make tent space while I built a campfire ring. Soon, flames crackled merrily as the scouts excitedly pitched their tents for the first time. That evening, after foraging the woods for kindling, I cooked a humble dinner for the group over the fire, letting the scouts take turns stirring our tinfoil meals. Their delighted faces glowed in the firelight as they devoured every morsel. Nothing fancy potatoes, carrots, and beef, but the boys appreciated it like a 4-course feast after the day's hike. Bellies full, we settled around the flickering fire for introductions and storytelling. One by one, I had each scout tell me about himself, his interests, goals, and what he hoped to gain from this wilderness experience. Many came from single-parent homes and were seeking role models and fellowship. I vowed to make this trip unforgettable for them. As the flames faded to embers, I lowered my voice to share spooky legends about the forest, weaving tales of hauntings, mysterious creatures, and strange disappearances. The boys listened in engaged attention, faces bathed in firelight. They slept heavily that night, dreaming of adventure. The first full day of our survival trip started off bright and early. After a hearty breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, I gathered the troop of scouts together to begin imparting some basic wilderness skills that might just save their lives if they ever got lost in the woods. I decided to start by teaching them how to forage for food. We hiked out into the surrounding forest, and I pointed out various edible plants and mushrooms they could keep an eye out for if they were ever without rations. The boys were fascinated and a little hesitant as I showed them which plants were safe to eat. Young Ian even tried nibbling on a wild onion shoot before making a funny face at the tangy flavor. Next, I demonstrated how to construct basic wilderness shelters. From building a simple, I put the scouts to work gathering materials from the forest floor and had them team up to put the skills into practice. It was comical watching their first attempts at lashing together branches into crude lean-tos that immediately collapsed on top of giggling scouts. But eventually they got the hang of constructing more stable shelters. I could see them gaining confidence in their new abilities. As evening fell, we headed back to our campsite, and I let the scouts gather tinder and kindling to start a campfire. Together we searched for wild onions and mushrooms to fashion up a humble forest stew in a pot over the fire. Despite the simple ingredients, the scouts were thrilled to eat a meal they had sourced directly from nature. After cleaning up, we all settled down around the crackling fire, its glow illuminating a circle of bright young faces. I let the scouts take turns telling stories and tales from their lives back home. Many of them opened up around the fire, sharing hopes and dreams or things troubling them. Others told funny stories that had us all keeling over with laughter under the stars. I soaked it all in, letting the teachings of the day settle into their minds. This is what I lived for as a wilderness guide, helping foster confidence and community while imparting practical skills. As the embers faded, I sent the scouts off to their tents to rest up for the lessons and adventures of the next day. I had a feeling they were going to pick up the skills quickly. The following morning after breakfast, I decided it was time to teach the basics of wilderness navigation and tracking. These were skills that could save their lives if they ever became lost in the woods. The boys were vibrating with pent-up energy, so I made it into a game. I had them partner up and gave each pair a miniature compass. Then I let them take turns leading each other blindfolded along a looping route I marked through the forest, using only the compass for guidance. Many ended up wandering in circles at first, but soon got the hang of using the compass points to stay oriented as they directed their blindfolded partners. In a small clearing, I gave a lesson on recognizing and deciphering animal tracks, teaching them the differences between the prints of various mammals and birds that inhabited the forest. We then fanned out in teams to search the area, competing to see who could locate and identify the most tracks correctly. Ben ended up winning, picking up on subtle signs of passing deer, rabbits, squirrels, and even an elusive fox. Already these scouts were proving themselves quick studies. We spent the rest of the morning mastering the age-old wilderness skills of setting traps and snares. I walked them through the steps of placing bait inside cleverly crafted slipknots or cages balanced with sticks that would tumble when prey entered. Their inventions grew more inventive by the hour. Soon, several triumphantly brought to me squirming rodents caught in their snares as I looked on proudly. That evening, after another campfire dinner, the scouts worked together to perform hilarious skits and songs about the day's exploits. Their banter and friendship warmed my heart. Already they were bonding like brothers. As I tucked them into their tents that night, their minds were abuzz with all the knowledge absorbed and wonders witnessed, from animal tracks at dawn to constellations wheeling above their campsite. As I made my final patrol of the camp perimeter, I noticed a stirring in the trees just beyond the ring of firelight. I paused, squinting into the dense woods until a shape seemed to detach itself from the shadows. It stood tall and upright behind a pine trunk, too still to be any forest animal. The hair on my neck prickled as its dark form watched me from across the clearing. Then, in a blink, it seemed to dissolve back into the darkness, leaving me wondering if it had been some trick of the moving shadows and moonlight. Probably just a stump or fallen log my eyes had momentarily given a human outline to. Morning dawned clear and crisp on the third day of our wilderness excursion. A light frost clung to the grass as the scouts emerged sleepily from their tents, lured by the scent of frying bacon and percolating coffee. After breakfast, I gathered the troop and led them downstream to try their hands at fishing. We came to a wide bend in the river that looked promising. I demonstrated how to thread a worm onto a hook, cast out a line, and reel in struggling fish. The scouts picked it up quickly, while also splashing each other and laughing. Soon they were whooping triumphantly whenever they landed trout, flopping and shimmering on the riverbank. I showed them how to brain the catch swiftly and humanely. Fish sizzled deliciously over the campfire for lunch. That afternoon I devoted to teaching the scouts which wild edible plants might sustain them if lost in the woods without rations. We foraged for fiddlehead ferns, wild leeks and onions, cattail roots, and tart wild berries. The scouts took to sampling everything, getting purple stains from blackberries all around their grinning mouths. I imparted warnings about poisonous plants to avoid as well. Their heads were soon overflowing with new knowledge about nature's bounty, waiting to be harvested by those with the skills and patience. During dinner that evening, as daylight faded, I spotted that now familiar stirring just at the edge of our campfire glow. A shadow seemed to detach itself from the gloom and stand watching, taller than a man. I froze with my fork halfway to my mouth, staring back hard until the dark form retreated slowly into the brush, like a timid animal. After cleaning up, we gathered around the crackling fire for our nightly storytelling. I decided to share some chilling local legends with the scouts, like tales of the creature they called the backwoods howler said to stalk these parts. The boys listened, enthralled and thrilled to be spooked before bedtime, not realizing my stories were meant to distract myself from the unnerving truth. Later, as I lay in my tent, unable to sleep, I peered out into the darkness, searching for any sign of the lurking figure, but for the sigh of wind through branches. As I finally drifted off, I had the creeping sense of being watched from just out of sight. I awoke to shouts and cries of alarm outside my tent. Heart-lurching, I scrambled out into the gray morning light, squinting through sleep-crusted eyes. The scouts were crowded around one of the tents, their voices shrill with panic. "Timmy's gone!" Patrick cried, voice breaking. I rushed over, pulse thundering in my ears. Peering into the tent, I saw Timmy's belongings, sleeping bag, lantern, clothes, neatly arranged inside, but no sign of the boy himself. "He's vanished!" Michael exclaimed. "We already looked everywhere!" My mind raced, struggling to shake off grogginess. Timmy must have disappeared in the night without a trace. But why? How? A chill gripped my spine despite the mild air. More scouts shouted over each other, their words jumbling together incoherently. I raised my hands to quiet the frenzy. Okay, calm down, everyone," I said, fighting to keep my own voice steady. "Are we absolutely sure he's not just off in the woods to relieve himself?" A dozen frightened faces turned toward me, eyes wide. Ben spoke up. "We looked all around camp twice over. He's nowhere. And someone would have woken up if he left the tent during the night." His words sent a spike of dread through my chest. The only explanation was unthinkable. Something had taken Timmy, stealing him away while the rest of us slept unaware. The scouts bombarded me with questions, demanding explanations I did not have. What happened to him? Where did he go? We have to find him. I raised my hands again, pleading for quiet. My mind reeled, groping for plausible excuses to cling to, sleepwalking, a midnight bathroom trip gone wrong. But in my bones, I knew the truth. A sinister entity lurked in these woods, and now it had claimed a young life. "I need you all to stay calm and stick together while I think about our next steps," I said, struggling to project a confidence I did not feel. Their frightened faces searched mine for reassurance. Inhaling deeply, I continued. "It seems Timmy left camp during the night unexpectedly, but we will organize search parties to look for him after sunrise. I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation." My hollow words did little to curb their panic. They huddled close, staring wide-eyed into the encroaching forest. I too found my gaze drawn to the shadowy tree line, unable to shake the crawling sensation of being watched. The right choice was suddenly, painfully clear. We had to flee this cursed place before the malevolent entity claimed another innocent. "Pack up camp now," I ordered, urgency edging my tone. "We're leaving immediately." Confusion flashed across their faces, followed by conflicted relief. They scrambled to take down tents and gather equipment with shaky hands. I hastily kicked dirt over the smoldering fire pit, then helped the scouts load up their packs. All the while I scanned the gloomy woods, expecting the tall, shadowy figure to emerge at any moment. Finally, we were ready. The boys looked to me anxiously, faces drawn. "Stay close and stick together," I said firmly. "We're getting out of here." A tight knot of nervous energy. I brought up the rear, constantly glancing back over my shoulder. Right before the forest swallowed up the abandoned campsite, I glimpsed a dark shape detach itself from a tree and stand watching. My heart seized. Then it turned and melted into the shadows. I led the scouts onward through the winding forest trails, anxious to put distance between us and the ominous entity that had taken Timmy. My compass and memories should have guided us northwest to the ranger station, but the further we hiked, the more disoriented I became. The land just didn't seem right. Creeks were on the wrong side. The shape of rock outcroppings was unfamiliar. It was as if the very landscape had changed and rearranged itself while our backs were turned. By late afternoon, with morale sinking, I finally had to admit we were lost, as I called for a rest break and attempted to radio the ranger station for guidance. But all that answered was a static hiss. No signal could penetrate this deep into the woods. The scouts practically collapsed onto mossy logs, faces drawn with exhaustion. We had been pushing a brutal pace in our desperation to escape, but now we were well and truly turned around. "Just a quick breather to rest your feet, then we'll keep going a bit further before making camp," I assured them, trying to mask the defeat in my voice. In truth, as the light faded, I knew we'd have to stop for the night soon. There would be no more progress until sunrise. I scouted the area as the boys wolfed down granola bars and refilled canteens from a burbling stream. Before long, I located a small clearing nestled between towering pines that could serve as our campsite. It wasn't ideal. The forest floor was rocky and sloped slightly, but it would have to do. We had no choice but to stay put for the night. As the scouts wearily pitched their tents and laid out bedrolls, I tried to boost their sagging spirits. "Come on, guys, look lively. This is all just part of the adventure. We'll get our bearings tomorrow and be at the ranger station in no time." A few managed weak smiles, but a darkness still hung over us. We ate a cold dinner of jerky and trail mix in silence. Normally there would be jokes and banter around the campfire, but tonight no one felt much like laughing. We just stared into the flickering flames, our minds left to imagine what sinister forms might lurk in the dancing shadows just beyond the firelight. Eventually, I corralled the scouts off to their tents, insisting that a good night's rest would refresh us all. But I had my doubts. The woods pressed in around our little island of light, and though I strained my ears against the silence, I heard nothing besides the usual sounds of crickets and wind through the branches. It was well past midnight and my watch was almost over. The surrounding forest was still, except for the usual night sounds. The drone of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, or the rustle of a creature in the underbrush. The scouts were all bundled in their tents, exhausted from another day of fruitless hiking in circles trying to find our way out. The campfire had died down to embers that cast a weak flickering glow across our small clearing. Fatigue weighed heavily on me as I huddled by the fading flames, struggling valiantly to keep my eyelids from drooping. Lack of sleep from the past week of fear and flight had crept into my bones, sapping my alertness. I shook myself forcefully, trying to regain focus. I couldn't allow weariness to dull my reactions with danger still lurking just out of sight. I stood slowly, joints stiff and aching, and began to quietly patrol the camp perimeter, hoping the chill night air would revive me. But it was no use. Bone-deep exhaustion had taken hold. As I checked the snares and noise traps I'd set up earlier, I nearly stumbled over an exposed root jutting from the ground. Cursing myself for the lapse in caution, I steadied against a tree trunk and squinted into the shadows between the skeletal branches. That's when a branch cracked sharply somewhere in the darkness behind me. I spun around, heart leaping into my throat, senses screaming alert once more. I stared wildly about, flashlight beams stabbing through the gloom, but nothing stirred besides wind through the gnarled boughs. Only an impenetrable void met my gaze no matter where I shone the quivering light. And yet some instinct told me something had been there just a second ago, lurking at the edge of vision. The very air had gone deathly silent, as if the forest held its breath. The fine hairs on my neck prickled. I swept the area again, gripping the flashlight like a talisman to ward off evil. But the shadows yielded nothing. Unease crept over me, like icy fingers down my spine. Some sinister presence was out there, concealed just steps away. I could feel its lurking menace permeating the night. I backed toward camp, skin crawling, senses straining for the slightest hint of movement. But the entity remained maddeningly elusive, while making its presence undeniably felt. My nerves were frayed to breaking point. Sleep evaded me as I lay rigid in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest through the thin nylon walls. Each creak of a branch or rustle in the brush set my heart thudding, anticipating the bone-chilling shriek of something inhuman piercing the night. I strained my ears until they ached, both dreading and wishing some unnatural wail would shatter the silence, so I would at least know where the lurking evil hid. But nothing revealed itself. The anticipation was a torture in itself. Exhaustion tugged at me, but whenever I slid toward restless sleep, images of glowing eyes and gnarled hands emerging from the shadows jolted me alert once more. So I focused on the scout's steady breathing, and the dying fires crackled just outside. A feeble reassurance we were not alone in the smothering dark. Dawn could not come soon enough. The instant murky light seeped into the woods. I awakened the scouts. They emerged from their tents, with pale skin and deep shadows under their hollow eyes. It was clear no one had slept well, if at all. But there was a frantic energy to their movements as they choked down breakfast granola bars and packed up camp. I could see the fear simmering just beneath the surface. We all could feel the sinister presence lurking somewhere just out of sight, obscured by night but not gone with daylight. The evil lurked all around us and seeped into the very bones of the land. The sun's return lent only an illusion of safety, but we clung to it desperately. Soon we were hurrying back down the trail, glancing anxiously over our shoulders. But the daylight buoyed our spirits some. The sunshine and chatter of birds washed away last night's oppressive aura of malice. Some color returned to the boys' cheeks. By mid-morning we came upon a familiar log bridge spanning a roaring creek. Moss covered the gray weathered wood, but I recognized its length and curve. "The trailhead can't be far now," Ben exclaimed, a note of hope in his voice for the first time in days. The group picked up pace, renewed vigor and purpose in their stride. Our goal was so close, tantalizingly within reach. Freedom from the endlessly looping, unnatural forest. But I knew in my heart the woods would not release us so easily. As we turned a bend in the trail, I braced myself and gripped my walking stick tighter, senses primed for the next attack. Perhaps this time we could face it in daylight while our spirits retained some hope. But hope was a slippery thing out here, dwindling the deeper we ventured through the trackless trees and shadows. Whatever lurked in the forest would not stop until it had claimed us all, in body or soul. It was only a matter of time, no matter how tightly I grasped at optimism to keep the darkness at bay. But as we rounded a bend, a towering oak suddenly blocked the path. The leaves were still green. This had happened recently. The scouts backpedaled with frightened cries. Dread congealed in my stomach, but inwardly, my mind reeled. There was no denying it any longer. A sinister intelligence haunted these woods, and it did not want us to leave. I turned to study the looming tree, searching for handholds, trying to quiet my racing heart. The scouts shifted nervously, looking to me for guidance, but I had none to give. Never had I faced a foe like this, whose attacks came from the very land itself. By the time we edged past the massive obstacle, daylight was already waning. I hesitated, considering whether to keep going or make camp. The woods grew shadowy, the setting sun casting long skeletal fingers between the trees. Let's keep moving while we still have light, I decided, unwilling to spend another night exposed. Stay alert and stay together. We pushed on into growing dark, the trail dwindling until we stumbled half-blind through the forest. Strange whispers followed us, branches clawing at our clothes. The scouts drew closer, knuckles white on their walking sticks, eyes glinted from the underbrush. When the last dregs of light seeped away, I called a halt. We would go no further tonight. I tried to reassure the scouts as we made camp, but hollow bravado could not mask the dread gnawing inside me. Our stalker was still out there biding its time, but perhaps I could surprise it first. I set simple snares and noise traps around our perimeter that night, improvising with string and tin cans from our gear. It was a futile attempt to deter an entity that could manipulate the very forest, but I had to try something to regain a sense of control, even if it was just an illusion. We sat around the fire, wrists aching from gripping weapons until flames died down to embers. When nothing disturbed the traps that night, it was somehow worse. The complete silence meant our opponent had changed tactics, lulling us into false security. And it was working. The tense anticipation was fraying our nerves. At this rate, it would not need to strike. Exhaustion and dread would deliver us right to its feet. Doubt and dread sat like stones in my belly. I had failed the boys, led them in circles to the point of exhaustion with no idea how to guide us out. By late afternoon, despair was etched into their sagging faces. The jokes and banter of days past were forgotten now. Silence hung over us like a pall. When I called for a brief rest, some of the boys slumped bonelessly to the forest floor, too spent to go further. Others whispered among themselves, casting suspicious glances my way as their faith in my leadership crumbled. "We've passed that weird-shaped boulder before," Patrick muttered. "We're going in circles. He has no idea where he's taking us," Jason said quietly. "We'll never get out at this rate." Their doubts stung, even if warranted. Finally, Thomas approached me, eyes downcast. "What if we can't find the trail again? Maybe we should just stay put and wait for a rescue." His words bubbled a rising panic in my chest. Give up out here? Impossible. But anger and frustration boiled over. "We can't just sit and wait," I snapped, harsher than intended. The boys flinched, their morale sinking further at my outburst. Immediately, I regretted it. They needed reassurance, not more fear heaped upon them. I drew a long breath and then met each of their eyes. "You're right to be worried. We're in a tough spot. But I promise you, we will find our way out together. I won't rest until you're all safe again." They glanced up, a flicker of tentative hope on their faces. "Just stick with me a little longer," I urged gently. My confidence was a charade, but it strengthened them. They rose on aching legs, ready to soldier on. Together we could withstand anything, I reminded them. For 2 more hours we hiked, until finally I spotted a rocky outcropping up ahead that seemed familiar. My initial hope curdled. I realized it was the same formation we had passed days ago. Dread sank like a stone. We had looped all the way back to where this nightmare started. That night, after setting up camp once again, I let the scouts huddle together for warmth and comfort while I kept watch just outside their tent circle. No fire could penetrate the smothering gloom beneath the dense forest canopies here. The surrounding blackness felt almost corporeal, like a sentient void waiting hungrily to consume us. Some primal sense screamed at me to keep vigil through the small hours, though I doubted by now that any mere mortal alertness could thwart this unseen menace. The weary scouts had collapsed into uneasy sleep, the day's fruitless wanderings having sapped all their energy. But sleep evaded me, my every sense strained to the snapping point, listening for any unnatural sounds. The night was unnaturally still, not even insects or nightbirds stirring. The silence itself seemed ominous. As the moon traversed the sky, Nothing disturbed the heavy quiet. But then, near midnight, blood-curdling screams suddenly split the stillness, cries of shock and pain that jolted the very marrow in my bones. I leapt up, racing toward the source before conscious thought could catch up. The screams issued from one of the tents on the far edge of camp, but before I could reach it, a writhing form was dragged forcibly from the tent by an indistinct black shape like living shadow. I seized the flailing boy's arms desperately, managing to snatch him halfway from the churning void's ravenous maw. In the darkness and panic, I still did not know which boy had been taken. "Help me! It's got me!" he shrieked, voice raw with terror. I locked my arms around his chest, straining with all my might. But I could not make sense of what I saw, just swirling darkness dragging at the boy's legs, no substance or defined shape to fight. This writhing entity had no body, no physical presence, and yet its pull was irresistible. The boy wailed and thrashed like a snared rabbit in its grip. I felt him slipping through my grasp as I strained desperately to wrench him free of the shadows. But the ancient evil's hold was relentless. Our panicked tug of war seemed to stretch on for hours. Finally, by some grace, the entity released its prey and withdrew, dissolving back into the blackness between the trees. I clutched the boy close to my chest, both of us shaking in the ringing silence. Though the entity had retreated for now, I knew the entity still lurked just out of sight, observing us. But slowly, the first pale streaks of dawn began to filter through the canopy, driving back the night. Perhaps we could claw back some fleeting illusion of hope with the light, though the coming day's trials seemed just as daunting. We had survived the longest and darkest night yet, but as I held the traumatized boy, I feared how much more we could endure. Soon enough, more screams would pierce the darkness, and next time, I might not be able to wrestle the victim free. That night, we huddled together in restless slumber, too exhausted to even post a watch. The impenetrable darkness pressed in oppressively close as we tossed and turned on the hard, cold ground, our minds still haunted by the day's horrors. Every creak of a swaying branch or rustle of undergrowth had me bolting upright, pulse hammering, convinced the swirling void had returned for us. But only the wind's lonely wail met my straining ears each time before I collapsed back into fitful dreams. I cannot say if I slept at all that endless night. Behind my closed lids, vivid flashes of glowing eyes and gnarled claws still tore at me, accompanied by distant screams that echoed bizarrely in the dark forest. I thrashed against my sleeping bag, drifting in and out of consciousness. As the sky gradually lightened from pitch black to dismal gray, I gave up on rest and lay watching the leaves sway overhead, their patterns almost taking on twisted faces and forms in the gloaming. But when true dawn began to come through the dense canopy, I noticed a peculiar gap in the underbrush that most certainly had not been there the night before. Heart thudding, I rose as silently as possible to investigate. Stepping delicately through the wall of ferns and brambles, I saw a relatively clear, narrow, seemingly angling toward a slightly brighter patch of forest ahead. It was badly overgrown in places, nearly obscured by some bushes and fallen branches, but still unmistakably some kind of trail. The first potential sign of escape we had discovered in days. Fragile hope quickened my pulse as I traced its winding route with my eyes. But something in my gut whispered it was too neat, too fortuitous after so many days and nights of hopeless, blundering wandering through the endless woods. This path promised escape, and that was exactly why it could not be trusted out here. The cunning entity had shown mastery over sculpting the very land to manipulate us before. What was to stop it from weaving this trail itself as bait? A snare to lure us deeper into its clutches. I stood weighing my suspicions as the scouts gradually began to stir from sleep and noticed the opened gap in front of them. Their excited whispers reached my ears, stabbing through the heavy morning quiet. A trail. It just appeared overnight, young Ian exclaimed in a rushed undertone. Do you think it could lead out? Or just lead us farther in? Jason replied nervously, ever the pragmatic one. Seems suspicious. Patrick shook his head firmly. No, it has to go somewhere better than here. This could be our way out finally. The badly concealed hope in his voice pierced my heart. I knew I would need to temper their rising optimism quickly before desperation sent them rushing heedlessly down this potential trap. We could not afford to be lured blindly into yet another cruel machination of this forest. Not this time, when we clung to life and sanity by such a fragile, fraying thread. Turning back toward the boys, I put on what I hoped was a reassuring expression as I walked back to rejoin them. Crouching down, I met each pair of eyes in turn, seeing my own weariness reflected there. We were at the end of our endurance, physically and mentally, and that was when mistakes were most likely to happen. I know you're all desperately hoping this trail might lead to safety, I began gently, and it very well may. But we need to approach it cautiously and stay alert for any signs it's a deception. The woods have played tricks on our senses before. They nodded, some casting uneasy glances at the surrounding trees as if seeing them for the first time as potential threats rather than simple plants. After a quick cold breakfast, we gathered our meager belongings and carefully made our way over to the mysterious path. Up close, it remained overgrown and treacherous looking, with exposed roots and low-hanging branches obstructing the way. But it was unmistakably a trail, however faint, and our only potential lifeline out of this nightmare forest. I took the lead, treading lightly and scanning for any signs of deception or danger. The boys followed in a close, quiet knot, keeping their walking sticks at hand. Our eyes constantly roamed the shadowy trees pressing in on either side, half expecting the benign trunks and branches to reach out and snatch one of us at any moment. The path held steady and true, angling gradually downhill through the sea of trees. After a few hours of hiking, the trail remained consistently narrow but discernible, spurred on by the ever so slightly brighter quality of light coming down through the rustling leaves ahead. It seemed we walked towards some far-off break in the emerald canopy, signaling a thinning of the woods. I hardly dared believe it could be true, after so many days wandering lost in endless identical forests. When we paused for a brief rest and meager lunch, I tried to raise the scout spirits with cautious encouragement. "I believe we're heading the right way," I said. "If we just follow this trail, it's bound to lead out of the woods eventually." Their faces brightened a bit at this, and talk turned hopeful for the first time in days as we continued on our way. We remained vigilant for any abrupt changes in the landscape or signs we were being turned back on ourselves somehow. But the trail held steady, inclining gradually uphill again as the afternoon wore on. By the time the light took on a golden, late-afternoon quality, filtered green through the leaves, we found ourselves cresting a ridge overlooking a wide valley. We hurried forward, hearts soaring at the sight of open sky at last. Beyond the sea of undulating treetops. "We must be close to the edge of the woods now," Patrick exclaimed. The others traded relieved laughter, the prospect of freedom so near. Even I allowed a swell of hope, though my ever-cautious instincts kept my guard up, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Thus far the path had led true, but when had the forest ever released its prey willingly? As dusk approached, the trail grew harder to follow, choked by thorny brush and fallen logs. We scrambled over and under obstacles until finally something up ahead caught my eye. A small cabin at the base of the ridge tucked among the trees. Smoke curled from its chimney, signaling warmth and life. We all rushed forward desperately. Sanctuary was so achingly close. As we pounded up onto the porch, I reached the front door first, pounding urgently. After a tense pause, a stooped old man peered through the crack, eyebrows rising at the crowd of filthy, wild-eyed faces on his doorstep. "Please, you have to let us in. We've been lost in these woods for days," I implored. The man studied us critically before swinging the door wide in wordless invitation. We spilled inside, sinking to the floor in overwhelmed relief as the door clapped shut behind us, shutting out the twilight woods. "Don't mind the mess. Just push my chair aside so you folks can rest," the old man said, clearing a space at a rough-hewn table scattered with books and gear. "Name's Ranger Joe. Let me grab some blankets." He shuffled deeper inside while I took quick stock of our cramped but comforting surroundings. The cabin was rustic and cluttered but sturdily built, with blackened iron cookware hanging over a stone hearth. Never had four walls, and a roof seemed like such a paradise. Once we had warm food and blankets, Ranger Joe sat down across from us and fixed me with a somber gaze. "Now then, suppose you tell me just what happened out there and how you folks ended up on my doorstep looking half dead." I hesitated, wondering just how much to reveal, but Joe's kind face and cabin had already earned my trust. Taking a deep breath, I began recounting our ill-fated journey, the survival excursion gone awry, the endless looping trails, vanishing scouts, and the lurking presence that had haunted us day and night. The words spilled out in a flood. I had not realized how heavy the burden of experience lay on me. The scouts occasionally chimed in to add chilling details, like the sight of trees moving on their own or the cries heard in the darkness. Joe listened intently, bushy eyebrows drawing together in concern, but no skepticism showing in his weathered features. Finally, I stumbled to a stop. My heart still pounded thinking back on it all. "You can't say I'm much surprised," he muttered. "Always feels to me like something unnatural is afoot in portions of that forest." He shook his head as if to clear it. "But that's just foolish talk most would dismiss. You all are safe now." I leaned forward intently. "But have you ever seen signs of it yourself? Of whatever haunts those woods?" I sensed this man knew more than he readily admitted. Joe held my gaze, perhaps gauging my sincerity and composure. Then he seemed to come to a decision. Standing stiffly, he signaled me to follow to a quiet corner while the scout slept by the fire. "What I'm about to tell you stays strictly between us. You understand?" He waited for my fervent nod before continuing. "I've come across strange things in that wilderness. Trails with no end, circles of stones in odd clearings, even footprints that vanish mid-stride." His eyes took on a distant cast as he described unnatural details I knew too well. Evidence of a cunning force shaping the land itself, lying in wait for those who strayed unaware into its realm. But I know the woods better than most, and there are ancient powers that dwell in the untamed places of this earth still. Awful things sometimes happen out there, and not all of them have earthly explanations. He held my gaze for a moment, almost studying me. When we finally returned to the fire, I felt aged 100 years from what I'd just learned. That night at the ranger station was filled with awful dreams and sounds. For many years, I, Matt, reveled in the silence of this forest. Throughout my life, I had grown accustomed to its whispers, knowing every tree, every pathway, as well as my own fingers. I was a guardian of the forest, a person who connected with nature on a level that others could only dream of. My morning routine began with awakening to the melody of bird songs. I loved that sound. It reminded me that each new day welcomed me into the embrace of this green kingdom. After dressing, as I stepped out of my modest cabin, I was greeted by the cool morning air saturated with the scent of freshness. My work was a part of me, and I was a part of it. I monitored the condition of the forest, checked the health of the trees, and cared for biodiversity. Being a forester was not just a job for me, it was a calling. My communication with these wise trees, green leaves, and lively streams made me happy. People might have thought that such a life was monotonous, but for me, it had its own rhythm, its own harmony. This forest became my home, and I was its guardian. My days passed in tranquility, and it seemed that nothing could disturb this idyllic existence. However, fate had something in store for me that would change all my foundations. And so it began. At first, I didn't pay much attention to these strange tracks, hoping they were simply the result of some wild creature passing by randomly. However, the longer I observed them, the more they turned into a puzzle I couldn't ignore. These tracks were unlike anything I'd ever seen. They were too large for foxes or raccoons and too unusual to belong to a bear. None of the animals known to me in this forest could leave such prints. My knowledge of the local fauna was impeccable, but these imprints defied the usual order. I started waking up at night, thinking about these tracks. They haunted me in my dreams, leaving a strange residue of unease. I traversed the forest back and forth, trying to find some logical explanation, but they simply didn't fit into the picture of this world. Perhaps it was some new species that I was not familiar with. I delved into my books, flipping through pages, but found nothing similar. My anxieties intensified with each passing day. It felt as if something unfathomable had penetrated this forest, casting a shadow of the unknown over it. The more I sought logic in these strange tracks, the more they became mystical. They seemed to pursue me, getting closer to my cabin. In the evenings, when the forest fell silent, I heard rustling in the bushes, and something heavy moved around, leaving behind these enigmatic traces. An unknown presence hung in the air, like a ghost you can't see but feel is there. I felt as though I were being watched, and this thought haunted me. At night, I heard footsteps around the cabin, but upon going outside, I found no one. My nerves were stretched to the limit. During the day, I tried to focus on my work, taking care of the forest. But when night fell, strange sounds and tracks returned like ghosts from the past. I began to lose sleep, and every rustle put me on edge. Fear seized me, and I realized that this was something much darker than I could imagine. Something that defied explanation in scientific terms. I knew I couldn't remain in this state of anxiety. Answers needed to be found before the shadow of this unknown completely consumed me. The night became even more ominous as strange sounds echoed around the cabin. Unidentified whispers and rustlings penetrated the darkness of the forest, as if nature itself was murmuring incomprehensible secrets to me. These sounds stirred anxiety, and my ability to discern their nature only heightened my unease. One morning, upon waking up, I noticed that the phone line connecting me to the outside world had been severed. My gaze fixated on the severed wires leading to my cabin. This was more than just strange noises in the night. Someone or something seemed to have deliberately cut my last tether to reality. Through the dense foliage of the forest, I peered, trying to discern any signs of who or what could have committed such an act. My rifle became my only ally in this struggle against the unknown. I loaded it, sensing that soon this weapon might become the last line of defense in this strange dance with the unfamiliar. Yet, even armed to the teeth, I realized that I didn't know what I was truly facing, and that my cabin, once considered a refuge, was becoming a trap in something beyond my comprehension. The gray glow of the sunset slowly penetrated through the tree trunks as I ventured into the forest once again, armed with my rifle and a heightened sense of invisible danger. The nocturnal sounds, tracks, and the severed line continued to disturb my peace, and my work became increasingly tense. I moved forward resolutely only when the sun ascended into the heavens. One day, pushing through the dense foliage, I felt eyes upon me. Something unseen lurked in the forest, weaving among the trees like mist, yet I couldn't discern its distinct outlines. My heart slowed its rhythm, and I scrutinized the surrounding darkness, trying to spot the shadow standing in the shade. I continued to work, but only in the daylight. Every sound, every movement of the trees could be signs of an approaching unknown. The rifle became my guide and support. Yet even with armed hands, I felt vulnerable in the face of this mysterious entity that seemed to observe every step I took. One day, looking up towards the impenetrable part of the forest, I noticed it. Something covered in thick black fur, towering over 2.5 meters with humanoid features. The gaze of the entity and mine intersected for a moment, freezing the blood in my veins. I sprinted towards my cabin, daring not to look back, and spent the entire night inside, awaiting the next day, relying solely on the sunlight, the only ally in this struggle against something that lurked in the shadows. With the dawn, as the first rays of the sun pierced through the branches, I resolutely decided to uncover what lurked in the depths of this forest. My experience as a forester and hands armed with a rifle carried confidence, but even the boldest confront the unknown. The tracks led me deeper into the forest, where even the most seasoned hunter rarely ventured. And there, amidst thick undergrowth, I saw it. It was something that defied description, a creature from the realm of nightmares. The face, flattened and covered in fur, resembled a nightmarish hybrid of a bear and a human. Its anatomy seemed grotesque and alien. A wide mouth with sharp teeth added horror to this strange being. The creature remained oblivious to my presence and continued moving deeper into the forest. My legs pulsed with determination, and I decided to follow it. At some point, I startled a nearby flock of birds, and the creature noticed me. It turned out to be even more intimidating and massive than I had thought. Now, standing before it, I realized its unnaturalness and understood that I was facing something beyond the scope of my experience. Gigantic, vivid orange eyes stared at me intensely, and I felt a chilling gaze piercing my soul. The creature was like a living nightmare, a creation that seemed out of place in this world. My resolve wavered, and terror took hold as I realized that my rifle, once capable of handling bears, now seemed powerless against this entity. A gunshot shattered the silence of the forest, and in that moment, I felt the fate of this strange creature become inextricably linked with mine. Its cry pierced the air, filling it with an ominous echo. However, despite visible signs of pain, it did not immediately fall. Instead, the creature darted into the forest, its shadow disappearing among the trees. A mix of adrenaline and fear compelled me to run back to the cabin. Sounds echoed behind me, intensifying with each step I took. Suddenly, I realized that the creature I had shot had decided to seek revenge. Its swift footsteps drew nearer, and I could feel my body drenched in cold sweat. For long minutes I raced through the thickets, my heart pounding furiously and my lungs burning. The sounds of pursuit became more persistent, as if the creature had transformed into an unseen force ready to engulf me. As I approached the cabin, I felt my strength draining from my legs. My gaze anxiously scanned the surroundings, trying to catch any signs that I was undoubtedly being pursued. The creature was determined not to let me go, and I knew that my life once again depended on the sole decision I could make in that moment. My legs, as heavy as stones, finally reached the cabin. With the last reserves of adrenaline, I forcefully slammed the door, creating a reliable barrier between me and the monster that was pursuing me. Yet, even through the thick wooden door, the sounds of its ominous roar penetrated. The silence in the forest was shattered by this howl emanating from the depths of the woods, filling the air with fear and apprehension. I had to make a difficult decision, either stay in the cabin and confront something I couldn't even see, or gather the last of my strength and escape. Hearing the creature beginning to break down the door, I realized I had no choice. I fired all the rounds from the chamber towards the doors, and the bullets pierced the wood with a dull, unsettling creak. The creature screamed in pain, and I heard its footsteps receding. It was only a temporary respite, and I understood that the monster would return, ready for cruel vengeance. Deprived of choices, I reloaded the rifle and sprinted in the opposite direction into the forest, seeking salvation. 15 kilometers from my cabin lay a village, my only chance for rescue. Fear consumed me, and I ran through thick thickets, feeling my life hanging by a thread. My legs, almost refusing to obey, carried me through the darkness of the forest. The sounds of the creature's enraged cries behind me emphasized that it was not intending to retreat. With each step, the darkness thickened, and I could hear the evening chorus of nature being replaced by the ominous howl of my pursuer. Exhausted and frightened, I reached the village, where the surprised and fearful residents let me into one of the houses. There, as I caught my breath, I heard an old grandmother of the village begin to unveil ancient legends about the master of the forest, a being capable of regeneration and impervious to mortal weapons. She recounted how many hunters had disappeared in this forest, attempting to hunt the master. However, having ventured into these dark lands, I had encountered it face to face and managed to survive. It was astonishing for me to learn that the creature indeed was the master of the forest, and it wouldn't let me leave so easily. That night, I realized that I had witnessed something beyond the bounds of reality, and I had managed to escape certain death. Yet this story remained in the depths of the forest, in that dark realm where the echoes of the ancient creature's howls resound, its secrets shrouded in mystery like the darkness of this enigmatic corner of the world. My parents and I got lost in Grand Gulch for 2 days. On the tail end of a 5-day trip, we were exiting the canyon. The route seemed a lot more difficult than we anticipated. We knew there would be a faint trail, if any, but once we crested the rim, we found out we were way off course. Knowing the general direction we needed to head, we started walking and conserving water as much as we could, having left the multitude of water pockets in the canyon below us. Slept that night under a pinyon pine and shared our last couple power bars, hoping to find some source of water the next day in the open desert. After a few miles the next morning, we finally came upon a faint road that became more pronounced as we went on. This road brought some good feelings, knowing we stashed a shuttle bike for someone to ride the last 8 or so miles to the van. Finally got to the bike cache, and my stepdad hopped on as a rainstorm started rolling in. After half an hour or so, it turned to full downpour, which was great because we were thirsty as fuck. After walking what felt like an eternity and wondering where our damn ride was, we walked upon the primitive ass, empty, other than our van parking lot. We see my stepdad tearing through it, trying to get the damn thing started. A dead battery. He ended up riding through thick mud another 6 miles to the highway to try to flag someone down. Ended up catching the eye of a ranger out patrolling who got us a tow and took us into Blanding, Utah while we got that bastard of a van running again. That felt like a lot for 11-year-old me. Me, my wife, 3 kids in Franconia, Notch, New Hampshire. We spent the week at a campground, visiting the basin and all kinds of cool spots, hiking Ridge Trail, etc. Second night, we got back late from hiking, ate and cleaned dishes, and was putting everything in the car, and a big black bear shows up and gets close enough that I could have touched his nose. I banged a big metal spoon on a pot right in his face. I thought he would either run or kill me. Luckily, he ran, but came right back. I did it again and followed him with it. That is the second most scariest thing from the trip. Number 1 goes to the last night we were there. It was 4th of July, hot and sunny all day. We watched fireworks in a nearby town and came back to camp. Around midnight, a storm came in so strong that rain was getting under the fly, so I went out with my son to put a tarp over the tent. Large tree branches were coming off and rolling through the campground, and very tall trees were bending low to the ground. I watched people abandon their tents and drive off, and their tents just blew away into the trees. I had no choice but to wait it out since I live 14 hours away in PA and didn't want to leave my stuff behind. By morning, telephone poles were down, and the place was a mess. I got no sleep all day, and all night waited for certain death, then attempted to drive home 14 hours. I made it to a farm in Vermont and took a nap while everyone else visited the farm store. It's a great memory, but scary at the time. My fiancé and I were on a camping trip last summer in Arkansas, casually grilling some dinner when we heard someone loudly yelling for help. I ran a few campsites over to find a clearly drunk man standing in a pool his own blood. Apparently, he had dropped his knife and nicked an artery in his ankle, which was spurting blood like a fountain. My fiancée was not far behind me and helped get it wrapped up and elevated while I ran back for my phone to call for an ambulance, only to find out I had no cell service. I knew there was a hospital roughly 20 miles away, so I made a judgment call and loaded the man up into his truck and took off. Now is a good time to mention that blood makes me super squeamish, and I think pure adrenaline is the only thing that kept me from passing out at the wheel. I made it to the hospital in 12 minutes, just as he started slurring his speech and hinting at losing consciousness. I still remember the pool of blood spilling out of the door off the floor mat as they took him inside. My fiancé picked me up from the hospital and we headed back. We ended up having to watch his dog and tried our best to have a normal evening. The man showed back up around 10:30 p.m. with 18 stitches. The doctor had told him if we hadn't been there or we had awaited for an ambulance, he would have bled out and died. Horrifying situation, but we saved a man's life.